Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conversation on language development. We're going to be looking at growth in language and a lot of the rules that are covered within this particular area. A lot of students really enjoy this class, but as usual, I encourage you, if you're getting overwhelmed by all the facts and all the information, to just pause, take a breath, and come back to the material when you're ready to be able to process all that's going to be presented. Going back to what we're going to be talking about today. As mentioned in the beginning, we're going to be focusing on a very specific aspect of cognition, and that's the topic of language. Now, from a psychological standpoint, or just from a basic definition standpoint, when we talk about language, we're talking about any form of communication that has some type of symbols that allows people to send messages or ideas to one another. And when we look at communication and language, typically we think of verbal language or we think of even written language skills. But in reality, there's a bunch of different ways that people can communicate with each other through language. So we could use sign language, we could use something like Morse code, and there's a number of different types of languages and ways of communicating that have been developed over the years. In fact, when we study language, we can see it coming from a number of different forms. We've got oral language, the one we're more commonly accustomed to thinking of with language. We've got written language, one where we can transition into a more visible version of language. And we've got another one that's more of a kinesthetic / visual one, and that's sign language. Now, when we look at our ability to understand things, and in particular history and growth, what a lot of researchers have recognized is that even though oral language is very important, it lets us get through the day-to-day, and it allows us to actually communicate with each other about some very immediate concerns. One of the big types of language that's really important for us, one that's been newly developed in terms of human beings, is written language. And that's because written language allows us to communicate across large amounts of time, large amounts of space, and we don't have to worry about being with somebody to communicate with them when we use this particular medium. Let's think of some of the benefits of language, actually. So we know that language might be good, but what are some of the things that that language actually helps us do? Well, when we look at some of the benefits of language, just a general idea of all types of language, we see that by having language, either written, verbal, or signed, we can save a lot of time in trying to communicate an idea, and we can also be much more topic specific, which means if there's something that we want another person to focus on or something that we want to address, by having language, we can get that person to bring their attention to that particular topic. It also obviously allows us to exchange information. So you can be talking to somebody on a phone about something that you experienced the other day, and they can get a sense of exactly what that experience was like, even though they weren't there, and even though they're not currently with you there at that particular moment. And by having that ability to have different experiences kind of incorporated into somebody's knowledge or understanding, you can get a lot more information about a given situation just by having these extra resources. So you can get different perspectives of somebody's interpretation of an event if all people experience the same exact event. And you can even get interpretations of events that happened long ago. And that medium of communication, in particular written language, allows for a very easy way of transcribing information and transferring it from one person to the next. But verbal language, as I mentioned earlier, also allows us to kind of communicate in a very specific way. And I guess texting has kind of replaced verbal language in the fact that with new ways of communicating with each other very quickly, like verbal language or texting or writing a message, we can exhibit not only past understandings, we can share experiences, but we can also allow people to know what our current thoughts and our current ideas are. So not only can we direct somebody somewhere, but we can give them a very good sense of what that direction or what that topic that we want them to focus on actually means to us. And once we communicate what that means to us, we can also start planning what we're going to do with that object or that idea or whatever we want to talk about in the future. What we usually talk about when we're looking at communication and how people actually get ideas across is a concept of something called infinite generativity. Infinite generativity essentially entails our ability to get any idea we want from one person to the next in almost an infinite number of ways. And when we have spoken language, when we have a very, very complex written language, most of us believe that there's kind of an endless number of ways that we can actually send somebody a message. So not only can we get somebody something specifically across, but we can get that across in numerous different ways. And that allows us to be very complex in our communication patterns. If we look closer at language, though, what we often see is that even though there's a number of different languages and a number of different mediums, all of them have very specific rules that are assigned to them. And those rules, those basic principles that are assigned to them, typically must be followed for somebody to understand what you're trying to communicate within that language. And if we look in particular at spoken language, we can recognize a couple of very basic rules that need to be learned and understood and development for us to be able to master this particular process. And one of the first rules, the first basic ideas of language that children have to pick up on is this concept of something called phonology. And phonology is the study of basic sounds that we use in language, and a phenome is a basic unit of sound. So when I say the word cat, I'm actually using a number of different phenomes to communicate that idea of the furry, fuzzy thing that you're thinking about right now. The k is my first phenome that I'm actually using. A is another phenome that I'm using, and t is another phenome. And all of those sounds, those basic ways of communicating, need to be combined with each other for us to make the word cat. And for a child, picking up on which sounds are important and which ones aren't is very important. Because if I say cat, or if I say cat, it's the exact same word. Right? I just stuttered a little bit, or I changed my voice inflection. And for a child, it's very difficult to understand that those two words are the same. But for you, if I said cat and then I said the cat walked around, even though I'm slightly changing my tone or I have an accent on something, you know that it's the exact same word. But for a child, knowing that that's the exact same word takes a lot of understanding. So when we look at childhood, one of the first big things we have to pick up on is what phenomes we need to focus on and which ones we need to ignore. And within multiple languages, what we often see is that the phenomes to focus on vary dramatically from language to language. So in Spanish language, there's a ruled R sound that children have to become attentive to because it has very specific meaning. In the United States, the ruled R doesn't mean anything. In English, or TH and L are very prominent sounds, very prominent phonemes that we have to learn as young children. But in other languages, in particular East Asian languages, a lot of them don't have the th and the L sound in their language, and they have to kind of replace them, and most oftentimes they're not very attentive to those specific sounds when they're presented. So if we think about a sentence like, just before I went home, I remember that I had to call Susie, that particular sentence, that phrase, has a ton of different phenomes in it. So we got ch, s, just in that very first word. And as you move throughout this sentence, you can identify a large number of phenomes, and all of those have to be understood and have to be kind of recognized for us to get the gist of what that sentence means. However, just knowing the phenomes of a word isn't the only thing we need to know in order to really understand and master a language. The next thing we need to be able to understand is this concept of something called morphology, or the units of meaning found in a word. Now, some morphology is very easy, so basic verbs, run, walk, eat, all of those phonemes have a very specific meaning. Right? Run, to move very fast, or eat, to take food or nutrition and put it into our mouths and attempt to, gain some value of substance from it. We could have other words, like, let me see, tree. And all of those words have very specific meaning to them. But in addition to those nouns and verbs that are very simplistic, we have other morphemes that we have to learn in order to understand our environment. So the word or not really the word, but the unit the morpheme is another entity that we have to understand in language in order to appreciate that language. So saying the word run is a verb, but runner isn't a verb, it's actually a noun. It's a person. And it has specific meaning. It's one who. And when we look at our language, when we look at morphology, those morphemes are something that we have to pick up on in order to understand what a person's actually discussing, what a person's trying to direct us to. And what's even more interesting with morphemes is even though a lot of them are fairly set, they vary from language to language, and they can actually change over time. So if I say the word photogate, you probably have this sense of a photo being involved in something extremely scandalous. What you don't think of automatically probably is a photo of a gate, even though the word gate and photo are in there. And that's because over recent years, in particular with the heated rhetoric that we have in our current kind of political climate, we have this expectation that something gate is almost always indicative of a scandal. But that wasn't always the case until Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal actually happened. If we applied the word gate to anything, people would have no idea what we were talking about. And when we see that particular example, and we probably could come up with a number of ones in addition to that, we can see how morphology not only helps us determine what's going on, but morphology can adjust to the environment to give us new information, to give us new meanings about what's going on. After we learn about morphology, we have our words and our sounds that we're focusing on, that we have to move on if we want to communicate a very complex idea. And the way we do that is by instilling a new type of rule called syntax, or combining words in a specific way that allows us to perform or to communicate appropriate ideas and phrases. So if I want to talk about Bob going to Tom's house for a drink, all right, Bob is the person that we're interested in. Going or went is a verb. They're moving from one place to the next, and it's Tom's house, and they're drinking. So all of these particular ideas need to be communicated in a sentence, but the way we communicate those ideas have to follow a very specific protocol. So if I use those exact same words in an attempt to communicate it, but changed around the order of those words, Tom went to drink for Bob's house, that makes almost no sense. And it definitely doesn't have the same meaning as the first sentence. And that really shows us that not only knowing the words and knowing the meaning of them is important, but knowing how we need to organize them in order to communicate an idea is also very, very important for us to be able to communicate. And we have to learn how to properly set up syntax in order to make sense. And what's even more crazy is when we look at syntax across different cultures, other additional rules are actually raised. So in English, if we want to use plural things, so instead of just having one cat but multiple cats, we have to add a letter. But that's not always the case in all plural terms. So if you've got mouse, it's not mouses, it's actually mice. And in other languages, instead of just changing the word cat to cats, you have to actually change the to a different the. So it's not le chat, it's les chats. And those changes, those rules that need to be followed in order to make sense is very, very critical in written and spoken language communication. And if you don't know them, you're not going to be able to communicate very effectively with people. If we actually follow along, though, so we know the difference, the rules for what to focus on, we know how to present it, then the last thing we need to be able to do is understand the meaning of a word or the meaning of an idea based on the syntax and based on all the surrounding information. And this deals with a new topic, a final topic that kids have to learn, and that's semantics. Knowing when a word means something. So if I gave you the sentence, the man batted his eyes while he hit the bat with a bat. You know that bat, even though it's used 3 different times, doesn't mean the same thing in any of those particular instances. Batted his eyes doesn't mean that he took a bat to his face and banged it against it. It means that his eyes fluttered very quickly. And then when he hit the bat with a bat, what he's saying there is he's probably hitting a flying object, something like a mouse with wings, with a bat, a wooden stick that you use in a specific game. Most of us don't think of the man beating his head with a wooden object while he flaps his arms, or I guess while he hits a flying object with his flapped arms, or he doesn't hit a wooden piece of wood with a live animal. All of you get a sense of what that sentence means just because of the fact that you've mastered this idea of semantics. And that's a process that actually takes time. And we can see how semantics change when we just look at multiple examples. So in English, if I said I can can my own vegetables while I can, well, if you don't know the particular type of dance called can, it might be confusing, but most of us know what that sentence means. And it's interesting that I can is something that's understandable to us. Most of the time the rule is we can't have 2 words repeated after each other, but can and can mean obviously 2 very different things in that particular sentence. What's even more amazing is if we look at other countries, other languages, even though our semantics are somewhat complex, other countries, their semantic rules become much, much crazier. So in Mandarin, there's a number of words that, when just pronounced with different inflection and in different spots in a sentence, can mean large numbers of different things. So there's the word sure. C-H-E-R. When you change the inflection on it, and when you change the location, this word can mean tons and tons of different things. I think there's over, if I recall correctly, over 100 different meanings for that one specific combination of letters. And when you see kind of crazy examples of this, I believe there's a poem in Mandarin that's entirely just the word sure, but it has very specific meaning. You can appreciate how important semantics are and how kind of wacky semantics can actually get from time to time when we look at spoken or written languages. However, when we talk about semantics, alright, having met syntax needs doesn't always mean that we've met our semantic needs. So you can understand a sentence because it's structured correctly, but the sentence can still not make sense on occasion. So even though we first have to understand syntax, semantics can sometimes override correctness in syntax, and we can still be confused by something even though we've met both the syntax, or we've met the syntax form. So If I said the grass watched the orange ear run the red shoe, the structure of that sentence makes perfect sense. All of the terms are in a very appropriate order, but obviously that doesn't make perfect sense, and that's more of a problem with semantics than the previous topic, syntax. It's one kind of random exception to the natural step of things in communication. The last big rule of spoken language that we need to at least address here in this class is the concept of something called pragmatics. Now, pragmatics is not something we think about that much in our spoken language or in our written language in Western culture. So give me that, and can I borrow that? Do you mean the same thing? And in some cases, one is more appropriate than another, but it's not nearly as important, or at least the concept of pragmatics isn't nearly as important here as it is in some other cultures. So in French in particular, and a number of other cultures, say East Asian or even Sub-Saharan Africa, or other kind of different dialects that present information differently. Italian's another one. When I ask something, the way I ask it changes based on people I'm talking to or the approach that I'm trying to take. So if I asked a very important figure, say my parents or somebody that I very much respected, and asked, are you? I'd have to say the words vous êtes in French, where if I was talking to a young child or somebody that I thought that was lesser than me, I would say est-ce que. And it means the exact same thing. It's just different structure based on the surrounding environment. And kind of picking up on that structure can give us information about the surrounding environment if we understand the pragmatics. The point of looking at all these topics, all these rules, is the fact that when we're learning a language, even though we think it might just be picking up on the word, the additional thing we have to pick up on is all of these different rules in order to really understand how a language actually works. When we look at where this development of language comes from, the ability to understand skills and understand all the different concepts that are essential in really communicating effectively, one of the first questions a lot of developmental psychologists and language specialists ask is whether or not these rules are entirely natural, whether or not every language in the world has to follow these different rules, and whether or not people within these cultures and different languages across the world are innately aware of them at birth, or whether or not they have to be exposed to them in order to, be sensitive to these specific types of rules. And answering this question has been extremely difficult over the years. Obviously, it would be extremely unethical for a researcher to take some young children, stick them in solitary until they're the age of 14 or 15, let them out, and then try to teach them language. And nobody's going to get past any review boards with that particular type of proposal. So when we talk about this idea of whether or not language skills are innate, whether or not we're kind of primed to learn these rules, for a long period of time, we didn't really have a definitive answer. Philosophers were the ones that came up with solutions to this, not psychologists. But a couple random cases over the years have given us some interesting insights into this question of whether or not language skills, attention to these rules, is absolutely innate, or whether or not it has to be something that we learn. The first example that we ran into over the years was a case of a young child found in France in 1799 that they later called the Wild Boy. Now, they found this boy wandering the woods of France. They actually found him in a city called Aveyron, I believe. And this particular boy seems to display behaviors that were indicative of actions of a wolf. And when they looked around for any indications or any signs that this particular child had been raised or nurtured by a human being, they couldn't find any evidence of human interaction. And what a lot of people came to believe was that this particular boy somehow was kind of taken in by wolves and raised by them. Now, it's more hypothetical than fact, probably, but they do know from this particular child that there seems to have been very little exposure to human beings throughout all of this child's upbringing. And when they looked closer at this child, one of the first things they started to try to do with him was kind of develop some level of what they called civility with him. And one of the first goals of developing civility within the child was to get him to learn language, get him to learn just basic communication skills. And what they found with this wild boy was, unfortunately, even after decades of working with him, he was only capable of communicating at a very, very rudimentary level. It was as if his first decade or so of upbringing kind of prevented him from ever being able to master language. And that really does give us some slight insight into this kind of idea of whether or not communication is something that we're born with. And then we went for around 2 centuries, without having any more information on this particular debate. But surprisingly, just about 40 years ago, we were exposed to another case, another instance, where language skills, and I guess the idea of innate language skills, came into play again. And this was when we discovered a young girl named Jeannie, who was locked in her basement, and for some reason her parents had kind of prevented her from interacting with anybody or even seeing the light of day not for decades, but for a large portion of her life. I believe it was into her early teenage years when they found Jeannie. And Jeannie, just like the wild boy of Aviron, kind of displayed the same language deficit. So when they finally found her and kind of liberated her from her parents, they started trying to teach her language. And just like the wild boy, she couldn't really ever develop any of the rudimentary language skills. She just kind of could make basic sounds and sort of communicate a few words, but nothing like we would think of any individual. I guess it was nowhere near what we would think an individual would be capable of picking up on. And when we look at both of these cases, it gives us some insight into this notion that this concept of language is something that has to be learned. We might be primed to learn it. In fact, at the end of class today, we're going to talk about some of the ways that we probably are primed to learn it. But even if we're primed to learn it, it seems like we have to be exposed to specific things, and we have to grow in specific areas in order to be able to understand language truly. And what we're going to be focusing on after we take a break here in the second half of the section is what those rules actually are and how this developmental process actually unfolds. So we'll move on to the next slide, and after that we're going to be taking a break. So please take a few minutes off, and when you're ready, come back and we'll look at how development actually interacts with this process of language.